leaders were embedded initially before founding the party in study society. They were members of study societies. That was the main socio-political organizational form preceding the foundation of a party. As for the personal and political bonds forged by early CPC leaders, well, you can see here four kinds of these political bonds and political organizations with which the communist leaders were more or less linked. In the first place, the old Chinese elite. Here, for instance, there is a punctual case, which is the family of Li Hongzhang. Li Hongzhang was a high-profile political figure of the late 19th century and early 20th century in China, in the imperial regime, and his family had some political links with one very important communist political figures, namely Chen Tuxiu, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. Secondly, the pre-existing political camp was constituted by two major political parties. First, the so-called Revolutionary Alliance, or Tonghui, which ultimately was transformed into the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, and secondly, the Jinputang, or Progressive Party, founded by another figure I already mentioned, which was Liang Qichao. These two political organizations divided the political camp in China into two groupings. The reformist grouping, which corresponded with the Jinputang, and the revolutionary groups, which was represented by the Kuomintang. And these groupings worked not only in Chinese territory, but also in the Chinese diaspora across Southeast Asia, but also in the American continent, for instance. Third, there was a radical group constituted by the youth organized around the journal New Youth. This group were the starting of the new culture movement, which was a movement which aimed at radically reform not only Chinese politics, but also traditional Chinese culture by frontally rejecting, for instance, the Confucianism as the prevalent ideology and worldview of the Chinese people. And the main political figures I put in the last order of my slide, which were three founders of the Chinese Communist Party: Chen Tuxiu, which I have already mentioned, Li Dachao, and Mao Zedong. All of them had more or less bonds, personal and political, with some of the four elements of my list. Ironically, the more radical and westernized politic and intellectual figure, which was Chen Tuxiu, was the person that had the more links and bonds established with all of the elements of my list. He was linked with the old Chinese elites initially in his early formative period, with some of the pre-existing political parties, and he was also one of the founders of the new culture movement. Li Dazhao and Mao Zedong had less political bonds with these three elements, and in the case of Mao Zedong, he was only linked with the new culture movement. In the fourth place, which were the political and ideological transformations occurred in the decades prior to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. First, there were ideological legacies. In spite of the Chinese early communist leaders apparently rejecting Confucianism or traditional Chinese ideology, there were some features of this ideology that permeated even the worldview of the early Chinese communist leader. You can see here some of the elements, for instance, an opposition between public good or common good understood as a desirable goal, as opposed to the private or the prosecution of selfish interest. The political action by means of cultural reform, which was a very important feature of the new culture movement, in which Chen Duxiu, Li Dazhao, and Mao Zedong were involved. And the third element, I don't have time to discuss it here, but I have a text which deals with it, which is the difference between the diverging interpretations of Confucianism. This was very important, for instance, in Chen Duxiu thought. Secondly, the early Chinese Communist Party leaders were very influenced by the failure of the previous reformist initiatives at the turn of the 19th century. Third, they were rapidly radicalized after 1915. Fourth, they were influenced by the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And finally, they were attracted by the policy of the international communist or the Comintern. For instance, the Comintern, based on geopolitical considerations, started to look, after having failed the revolution in Western Europe, to East Asia. And in order to do so, they, through the Karahan Declaration of 1920, they publicly offered to the Chinese, not only to the Chinese government, but also to the Chinese people, all of the territories previously acquired by the Tsarist Empire at the expense of China. So this was a very, very important element that helps us to understand why the communists were attracted by not only the Russian Revolution, but ultimately the Marxist, Leninist ideology and organizational form. So, as for my conclusion, Laura, I don't know how much time do I have. Please tell me. 5 minutes, it's okay?
Yes, 5 minutes, okay.
Okay, so then I will read my conclusions, which is, I'm sorry, can you see my PPT?
No, not yet.
No?
No, I think it is the final slide. That's why
okay.
you have to go.
I will share it again. Please,
Okay.
please have patience. I don't know. I must have touched a button.
Yes, now yes.
Unintentionally. Oh, yes. Here, sorry. In my work, by detaching some dimensions pertinent to the formative context of the CPC, I hope to have shown how, on the basis provided by the evolution of certain organizational forms deployed by a part of the literate strata of the Chinese population and the development of its links and political ideas, these processes redounded in the adoption of a doctrine which, well adjusted to the international context of the times, allowed for the first time since 1839 to find the formula with which to conduct the country towards its effective liberation. In this sense, the ideas heatedly debated by the intellectual revised characters matter as much as the functionality of those ideas for the established purposes. The period mediating from the end of the 19th century and the beginnings of the 1920 decades appears in this sense as a dizzying succession of debates, each time more radical, in which the conducting thread of the transformations that are taking place in the realm of the political ideas is hard to grasp. One of the more important milestones for the proper comprehension of the period is no doubt the outbreak of the 1919 May 4th events. This milestone motivated, on the one hand, the further acceleration of the ideological transformation within an intelligentsia already radicalized by the new cultural movement. On the other hand, it finished makes sense to the 4 previous years initiated with the appearance of that movement, transforming it into a national regeneration movement. Finally, like this, the horizon of purposes underlying the quest of the political projects succeeding prior to 1919 was finished outlining. This is supposed to state that as well, on the other hand, that the above-mentioned purposes implicitly underlay throughout the years. Secondly, it just remains to advance that these purposes coincided with the interests of the majority of the Chinese population, previously subject to both domestic and foreign oppression. Finally, the organizational form and the concrete strategies that the communists adopted after 1921 suffered internal transformations of another kind once surpassed the threshold of the formal constitution of the party. To validate these sentences, of course, exceeds the element offered to the reader of my text. I hope that they incite the necessary debate. At the same time, we commemorate the centenary of the CPC Foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Santillán. Very informative and from an historical point of view. Now it's the turn of Professor Liu Huawen, a dear friend in our common project. And Professor Liu Huawen is Professor of International Law, Assistant Director of the Institute of International Law of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, is Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights Studies, also in Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Deputy Chief Editor, Chinese Yearbook of International Law, Chinese Society of International Law, Deputy Chief Editor of the Chinese International Law Review, also with CAS. Author of numerous publications on international law and human rights law, and his expertise is international law, especially on the UN human rights treaties and their implementation in China. Today is giving us a speech on construction, a community with a shared future from humankind and China's international law stance viewed from an historical perspective. Thank you, Professor Liu Huawen. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Maria. Good morning and good evening. Dear Director Professor Kosani, Director Professor Lu Minli, dear Laura, other colleagues and friends. Just now, Mr. Santillán mentioned the May 4th movement. Laura, do you remember you visited my Institute of International Law, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences? Our institute is located in the very site where the May 4th movement started. Now I'm very happy to participate in today's conference, and especially as the Chinese Communist Party is celebrating its centennial birthday. International law is closely related to history because it's not only the sum of rules, but also a system derived from state practice. When I studied in Peking University, my teachers, the old international law scholars of China, emphasized repeatedly that the study of international law should be combined with the study of international relations, especially the history of international relations, the diplomatic history of China. I want to say the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government have always attached importance to international law. A clue to the dimension of international law can be found in the history of the party, the history of People's Republic of China, and the history of reform and opening up in China. For the first, at the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic of China, it attached greater importance to the role of international law. From the very first day of its founding, the Communist Party of China, I mean the year of 1921. The Communist Party of China has made saving the country, opposing imperialism and colonial rule, and striving for the national independence and rejuvenation as its goals. And in the year 1949, at the beginning of the founding of New China, the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government attached greater importance to international law. Our Premier Zhou Enlai invited and appointed the then president of Wuhan University, Professor Zhou Gengsheng, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a full-time legal advisor. He was the very first legal advisor to the Foreign Ministry of China. And since then, Professor Zhou Gengsheng devoted himself to the cause of the new China's diplomatic laws and treaties for more than 20 years. According to Mr. Li Haopei, the first Chinese judge of a criminal tribunal for former Yugoslavia, Li Haopei, he said Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai respected Mr. Zhou Gengsheng a lot. Important diplomatic documents were not issued without consultation with Mr. Zhou Gengsheng. As an expert, Mr. Zhou Gengsheng reviewed the English country name translation of People's Republic of China. He suggested the very name of Chinese army going to North Korea in the name of Chinese People's Volunteer Army during the war to resist the US and aid Korea. In 1958, he established the 12 nautical miles of territorial sea ways and established the legal status of Bohai Bay and the territorial bay. He also contributed to the restoration of the UN representation of the Beijing government. At the beginning of the 1950s, New China was awaiting prosperity, but it was besieged by Western countries, and there were doubts and even hostility of neighboring countries. The first generation of leaders of New China put forward the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence with outstanding political wisdom, which is in line with the new historical trends and trends in international relations after the Second World War. It laid a solid foundation for the development of a new international situation for China. The spirit and the content of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence were absorbed in UN documents such as the 1970 UN Declaration of International Law, the UN Declaration of the Principles of International Law, and gradually became the basic principles of international law later. At present, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence have been written into China's treaties on establishment of diplomatic relations with more than 160 countries. Secondly, in the process of reform and opening up, the role of international law has become more and more prominent. In December 1978, in the report of the Central Work Conference entitled Emancipating the Mind, Seeking Truth from Facts, and Looking Forward in Unity for the 3rd plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, Mr. Deng Xiaoping proposed that we must vigorously strengthen the study of international law. Because of this sentence proposed by Deng Xiaoping, in February 1980, the China Society of International Law was established in Beijing, becoming the first national legal academic organization established in mainland China after 1949. It can be said that since the beginning of reform and opening up in China, we have attached great importance to the study and application of international law. At the end of 2001, China formally joined the World Trade Organization, and since then, the pace of China's reform and opening up has accelerated. The economic development and social progress have entered the fast lane. In 2018, and the celebration of the 40th anniversary of reform and opening up, 2 of the 100 people who received the title of pioneers of reform in China were international jurists. One was former judge of the UN International Court of Justice, Mr. Shi Jiuyong, and the other was Madam Professor Zhang Yuejiao, the former chairperson of the Pure Committee of the World Trade Organization Dispute Settlement Body. In 1981, China's National Economic Plan carried out a large-scale adjustment, and it was necessary to terminate the foreign-related contracts of some key projects. Then, several international law professors produced legal advices for the authority, avoiding the country's major losses of hundreds of millions of dollars. From 1979 to 1987, individuals in the US filed against China, claimed the Huguang Railway bond interests issued in Qing Dynasty. And the Chinese international law jurists helped the government to answer the case, and this drive to emphasize the principle of international law on sovereign immunity and the non-inheritance to bandits of the old dynasty. And last, the Supreme Court of the US reversed the judgment against China. So for more than 40 years, one of the successful experiences of China's reform and opening up is that we emphasize international law and use it more and more. We not only integrate into the international community, but also actively engage in international economics, politics, education, science and technology, culture, sports, and other fields. Efforts are made to play a role in promoting the formulation and development of international law. Thirdly, under the new international background, the advancement of international relations requires strengthening the research and application of international law. Now, since the beginning of the new century, the world structure has continued to differentiate and reorganize. The changes unseen in a century are accelerating. With the development and the rise of China, China is getting closer to the center of the world stage, and the China's threat theory appears from time to time, and doubts about China's development objectively exist. Chinese President Xi Jinping said, in face of China's growing size, some people are beginning to worry, and some people always look at China with colored glasses, thinking that China's development is bound to be a threat. This can only prove one truth again: prejudice is often the hardest to eliminate. Just as China put forward the 5 principles of peaceful existence in the last century, the proposition of building a community with a shared future for mankind will surely help answer the international community the questions about how China develops and where is China going. At present, the UN Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, Human Rights Council, and other institutions have used the wording of building a community with a shared future for mankind in resolutions. At the same time, we also realize that the theories and the propositions of building a community with a shared future for mankind need to be legalized in the sense of international law, which requires time. This is related to the expression and dissemination of China's international ideas, and at the same time, promoting the construction of a fair and just new international order. The Sino-US relationship is one of the most important bilateral relations, and is also an issue of great concern to everyone. Looking back, since the establishment of the diplomatic relations between China and the US, there have been twists and turns. At a critical juncture, it's still necessary to emphasize peaceful coexistence. In 1989, Sino-US relations experienced severe friction. At that time, Deng Xiaoping emphasized that we should devote ourselves to building a new political order that abides by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Today, Sino-US relations can no longer return to the past. Moreover, the nature of the competition and confrontation in various fields between China and the US is a political fight, and to be more exact, it's the legal fight. Many problems in our development are created by the US and other Western countries. There are many ways to solve these problems. Legal thinking and the legal approaches are very important. Now China emphasizes coordinating the domestic rule of law and the international governance of law, and firmly supporting the international system with the UN at the core, and the international order based upon international law. China and the Latin American countries have a deep traditional friendship and a positive willingness to cooperate. Under the new international situation, China-Latin America relations will surely become closer, and China and the Latin American countries and people will have more mutual understanding and mutual trust and cooperate better. With Chinese and Latin American scholars, especially those engaged in international research, like you and me, can play a constructive role as a bridge and make continuous contributions to the strengthening of our relations and the deepening and expansion of our cooperations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu Haowen. It's always a privilege to listen to you and your speeches, really. Now, I give the floor to Professor Sun Hongbo of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He is doctor and associate professor in the Institute of Latin American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences since 2007. From 2015 to 2019, he was policy researcher in the political section of the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in Argentina. From October 2011 to September 2012, he was visiting professional at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He holds a PhD in Latin American economics and a master's degree from the Research Institute of Fiscal Sciences of the Ministry of Public Finance of the People's Republic of China. His research interests include the China-Latin American relationship and energy cooperation, and has authored and co-authored a number of academic papers, books, and articles on these topics. So an expert on Latin American studies. Today, Professor Sun is going to talk to us about a community of shared future for mankind, an imaginary myth or a realistic dream for China and Latin America. So I give you the floor, Professor Sun. Sorry, your microphone is mute.
Now it's okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you, Maria Fresca. Con mucho gusto. Buenos días, todos amigos argentinos. Good morning, dear friends from Argentina. Rob, Norberto Salani y Gustavo Salini, Laura, con mucho gusto. It's a very great pleasure to meet our friends, now discuss this topic. I'll share my, now is it okay? Share the PPT? Okay. Thank you, Gustavo Salani, shared the early history of CPC, and Professor Liu shared from the law perspective, international law perspective, combined China policy, foreign policy. Enjoy your presentation. Also glad to meet our colleagues, Lu Minli. So my presentation chose this title, Imaginary Myth or Realistic Dream, because during these years, when I contact Latin America students, professors, I have impressions. The concept of a community of shared future for mankind is very difficult to understand, because we have a very different discourse. I generally have very deep impressions. So I congratulations the China Study Center of La Plata University for many topics on these congratulations. And as we know, tomorrow is very important for 100th anniversary for CPC. Yes. So why are you imaginary myths? It's very not deeply when I make interview or talk. So we have different ideas, different discourse, but asymmetric. You can see in Latin America, in Argentina, China experts sometimes followed this concept, understand. It's also for us sometimes very difficult to translate. You can see from the conference agenda, the first page, the community of shared destiny. Sometimes it's the community of shared future. I think it's a very, very historical philosophy topic. So how can we understand this? If you can from the beginning of the century, peaceful writing, harmony word, stakeholder, or community of shared interest. So many, I think some of the policy terms, how can we exchange with our colleagues in Latin America, in Argentina, in the international relations studies are very challenges. How can we, from the academic perspective? So my effort try to understand from Argentina perspective, the history of Argentine diplomacy, some similar ideas can make comparisons. So you can see the community of shared future, I think a very China style thought and impression, which we said Chinese wisdom, China voice, China solution. I think it's very important to follow the systematically China impression is very important. Second, I want to go back a bigger history to understand the contacts between China and Latin America, the age of discovery. Why? What's the big reasons? You can see the Silk Road disrupted, the West-East connectivities is blocked. The bigger history, I think, connected. You can see later history, the maritime Silk Road extended to the Pacific rim of Latin America, the triangle trade, Philippines, Mexico, and Portuguese is a big link, a big histories. I think two examples are very important. You can see the food species introduced to China is very important to support the population growth in indigenous state, very important. And another thing very important is the silver currency, global circulations. You can see in China, many history study this phenomena. As that in that historical period, is you caught some inflations, many issues. Why the capitalism rising in West Europe? I think the bigger history, because when we discussed the community of shared future, I think it should go back to big history to understand this. Another example I can give you, the Argentina famous scholar Juan Bautista Alvedi. He makes the Constitution 1853. I read his books. He mentioned he realized the importance of the Pacific and Asia. At that time, he imagined Latin America possibly can be a springboard connected, linked Europe and Asia. I think very look forward, I think, his ideas. Another thing I think we discussed For me, I just want to understand how to understand this cost difference. I try to understand from the Latin America perspective, their diplomatic history compared to China's practice. You can see Latin America, West Hemisphere idea, Pan-Americanism, Hispanic Americanism, international system. So many ideas. I think Monroe Doctrine in recent years is hotly debated. Also, Pan-Americanism is a very famous Chile scholars, Alejandro Araveles, he mentioned this, discussed, promote these ideas. Another important figure in Argentina, I think, as we know, Carlo Doctrines, non-intervention principle, are very important ideas to discuss in inter-American system. Another important famous figure is Drago Doctrines. He is the Minister of Foreign Affairs Argentina. He insists the principle of sovereignty, territory inviolability, such ideas. You can compare it with China's, we said 5 principles of the peaceful coexistence. We can make comparisons. How can we stand from the history? Argentina and Latin America's their practice, how to compare the China's practice. How can we summarize generally that values, principles, make comparisons are very important in the global system change. Second, nowadays we discussed a lot about community of a shared future for mankind. I think in Chinese, we said 2 constructions. One construction is for a new form of international relations. What's the meaning? The mutual respect, justice, win-win corporations, fairness, and another is Belt and Road Initiative. We said it's a new platform for international corporations. There are many discussions about this one boat and road initiative. Now, 19 Latin American countries signed this MOU. Yes. Another important said, I think 5 words in one. In Chinese, it's very, we discussed this idea of open. We should open and inclusive development, inclusive international system governance, the open. For example, the WTO, their governance reform, clean and beautiful, the climate change. In Latin America, we have the new energy project with Argentina, in Brazil. I think very important. And lastly, peace. Okay. University security, common prosperity. Now you can see now we promote the high quality development of China economic relations with Argentina. We can take Argentina, for example, the infrastructures, the high technology programs, also with support of the educations. I think if we understand the core of a community of a shared future for mankind, you can generally speaking, So it's very difficult for me to summarize or how can we achieve the community of a shared future for China, Latin America. I think basically the development community up to now, you can see in the monetary policy, in Latin America, China's influence, the trade, investment with China is the second for most of Latin American countries, the second trade partner. You can see China's currencies swap with Argentina, very important for Argentina keep financial stabilities. I mean, when we discuss the practice mutualism, you can see G20 or BRICS, on the UN, very important. I think in China and Latin America, we have the tradition principles modernism. Another emphasized development opportunity, particularly in the epidemic impact in the economy, social impact, economic impact, very serious. How can we keep the trade? How can we make the plan for the future economic development growth? How can we promote the projects? Go ahead. Yeah. The third, how can we open world economy? Now you can see the anti-globalization. Some protectionism is strong. Now you can take Argentina, for example, the sovereignty, the debt restructuring. Up to now is a hot topic. How can we make in the Paris Club or in the International Monetary Fund? How can we make an open world economy, make it sustainable? Another is think South-South corporations. I think China and Latin America, South-South corporations, for example, the anti-poverty reductions. We can share knowledge, experience, we can workshop like this. Finally, I can say is that reform global governance system. You can see now Inter-America Development Bank, now how to can enroute their capital. Now World Bank, International Monetary Fund, how to reform. Now I think it's a very big changes, it's very challenges now. Yeah. So for my conclusion, I think for China and Latin America is promote the economic cooperations and there's educational change. We need talent. We need for students for the future, more seats to support the growth. We need more talent, professionals to study this. So my conclusion is how to say combines the education, put the education, culture, an important pillar to support, deep understand each other. Okay, it's difficult for me to find a conclusion, but I think the more topic we should discuss deeply. But I just generally share my understanding from Chinese perspective and Argentina perspective. My interest is I think we need a more deep study, understand it deeper, and promote future cooperation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor San Hongbo. Really interesting your perspective because it's very complete and it puts in an opposite side between what is a sort of mystification or sort of damnation of this new expression. So really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Now I give the word to Laura.
Oh, thank you, Francesca. Well, we have to present now to Dr. Alejandro Simonov. He is a professor and graduate in history at the National University of La Plata. He is master and doctor in international relations of the same university, ordinary professor of general history of University of La Plata, and of Argentine foreign policy in the Catholic University of La Plata. He's part of the incentive program as a researcher professor, and he's member of the Institute for Research in Humanities and Social Sciences, and of course of our Institute of International Relations. And he's the coordinator of the Center of Reflection on International Politics. Dr. Simonov is an important researcher here in Argentina in our integration process and in the autonomy theories in Latin America. So he will talk especially about the contribution from the Southern Cone of America and China on the construction of international relations from a global perspective, autonomy and Tianxia. For this part, Diego Riddick, the secretary of the Chino, will assist us with the translation. So thank you, Diego. Alejandro, la palabra es toda tuya. Gracias.
Tienes que prender el micrófono, perdón, Alejandro.
Bueno,
Ahí va.
buenos días a
Gracias.
todos y todas. ¿Qué tal? Buenos días a todos y todas. Antes de comenzar mi exposición, quisiera agradecer a la doctora Stayano por la invitación que me cursara en nombre del Centro de Estudios Chinos del Instituto de Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata, a su director Norberto Consani y a las profesoras Laura Abogado y Milly Lung por esta invitación a esta conferencia del centenario del Partido Comunista de China. Disculpen mi capacidad para expresarme correctamente en inglés y agradezco la predisposición de los organizadores para coordinar una traducción acorde a la relevancia de este evento. Nuestra exposición consistirá en un breve repaso de las contribuciones al campo de las relaciones internacionales desde los extremos oriental y occidental del mundo. Es un dato concreto que la disciplina se ha caracterizado por ser un ámbito cuyo núcleo duro estuvo afincado en el mundo académico anglosajón, incluso la presente caracterización geográfica que recién acabamos de presentar, y que la utilizaremos hasta encontrar mejores modos de hacerlo. Sí.
Muy bien, empiezo a traducir de Alejandro. Good morning, everyone. Before starting my presentation, I want to thank Dr. Maria Francesca Stayano, Dr. Norberto Consani, and Dr. Laura Abogado for the invitation they extended to me on behalf of the Center of Chinese Studies and the Department of Asia and the Pacific of the Institute of International Relations of the University of La Plata for this commemorative conference of the centenary of the Communist Party of China. Our talk will consist on a brief review of contributions to the field of international relations from the eastern and western ends of the world. Our discipline has been characterized as a field whose hardcore was based in the Anglo-Saxon academic world, even present in the geographical characterization that we have just presented and that we use until we find better ways of doing it.
Sin embargo, esta caracterización anglosajona no impidió que por diversas circunstancias surgieran aportes desde los márgenes del mundo, como son la autonomía y la tancia, que no siempre han sido valorados por aquel centro. ¿Qué es la autonomía? Para sus principales referentes del Cono Sur, el argentino Juan Carlos Puig y el brasileño Helio Jaguaribe, la construcción de márgenes de maniobra es una capacidad, cuyo logro no es estable ni permanente, ya que está sujeto a criterios dinámicos. Estos son la viabilidad del contexto internacional, la posesión y o creación de aquellas capacidades y la voluntad por parte de las élites de impulsarlas. Para Jaguaribe, los países con autonomía poseen un margen bastante amplio de autodeterminación en la conducción de sus negocios internos y de una apreciable capacidad de actuación internacional independiente. Con un desarrollo similar, Puig argumentó que la libertad de acción de los países se debe a la existencia de ciertos resquicios en el sistema internacional para defender sus intereses nacionales, aunque formen parte de un bloque. Sí, digo.
Muy bien. However, this characterization did not prevent that, due to various circumstances, contributions from the margin, such as autonomy and tianxia, arose, which have not always been valued by that center. What is autonomy? For the main leaders of the Southern Cone, the Argentine Juan Carlos Puig and the Brazilian Helio Jaguaribe, the construction of room for maneuver is a capacity, the achievement of which is neither stable nor permanent, since it is subject to dynamic criteria. These are the viability of the international context, the possession and or creation of those capabilities, and the will on the part of the elites to promote it. For Jaguaribe, the countries with autonomy have a fairly wide margin of self-determination in the conduct of their internal business, and an appreciable capacity for independent international action. With a similar development, Puig argued that the country's freedom of action is due to the existence of certain loopholes in the international system to defend their national interests, even though it is a part of the bloc. Adelante, Alejandro.
Sí, la aparición de este concepto, el de autonomía, fue un hecho cardinal en la institucionalización del campo disciplinar de las relaciones internacionales en el Cono Sur, y que fue posible gracias a los aportes cualitativos de la Especial y de la teoría de la dependencia, además de los efectos del segundo debate de las relaciones internacionales. Claramente estos análisis contaron con una base material, que fueron los procesos de industrialización que tuvieron lugar en el Cono Sur, y así lo entendieron los cepalinos, que necesitaban, que para poder realizar nuestra industrialización se necesitaban bases autónomas para ello. La autonomía no se ha estudiado mucho en el mundo desarrollado, tal vez porque, según Tucídides, los poderosos actúan y los débiles padecen lo que deben, y ello marca nuestras agendas. Por ejemplo, los autores neorrealistas como Waltz, que le asignan a la autonomía ser uno de los 3 intereses objetivos que los estados detentan al margen de la búsqueda de la supervivencia, u otros muy críticos de ella, como es el caso de Krasner, producto de las fuentes en que abrevó el pensamiento autonómico, donde además de las latinoamericanas también encontramos el realismo y sus críticas, que le otorgaron a este pensamiento una condición de hibridez, según Arlen Tigner. Pero esa cualidad la entendemos como una creación de una nueva originalidad, no como su ausencia. Sí, Diego.
The appearance of this concept was a cardinal fact in the institutionalization of the disciplinary field of international relations in the Southern Cone, which was possible thanks to the qualitative contributions of Cepal anti-dependency theory, in addition to the effects of the second debate on the international relations. Clearly, this analysis had a material basis, which were the industrialization process, since, as the people of Cepal, they needed to search for autonomous bases for this development. Autonomy has not been studied much in the developed world, perhaps because, according to Thucydides, the powerful act and the weak suffer what they must, and this sets the agendas. For example, neorealist authors such as Waltz, who assign autonomy to be one of the 3 objective interests that states have regardless of their survival, or others who are very critical of it, such as Krasner. Product of the sources where the autonomy through arises were in addition to the Latin American ones. We also find realism and its criticism, which gave this thought a condition of hybridity. But we understand this quality as the creation of a new originality, not as its absence. ¿Seguimos?
Sí. A medida que el modelo de globalización avanzó, la autonomía para los países periféricos pareció reducirse, pero ello no impidió que muchos autores, como Raúl Bernal Mesa, Alfredo Bruno Boloña, Luis Amado Cervo, Miriam Colacray, Luis de la Negra Pedraza y Tulio Di Sebagni, entre otros, continúen pensándola. Sí.
Muy bien.
Diego.
See, as the new model of globalization advanced, autonomy for peripheral countries seemed to shrink. But this did not prevent many authors, such as Raúl Bernal Mesa, Alfredo Bruno Boloña, Luis Amado Cervo, Miriam Colacray, Luis Dalla Negra Pedraza, and Tulio Vigevani, among others, from continuing to think about it.
Ahora, ¿qué es la tancia? Es un sistema conceptual chino aparecido hace más de 3 milenios durante la dinastía Zhou, que incluso puede rastrearse más atrás, y que ha sido rescatado recientemente por Zhao Tiyang como un modo chino de pensar las relaciones internacionales. Según este autor, el sistema buscó en sus orígenes resolver los problemas específicos de lo pequeño gobernando lo grande y lo uno gobernando lo múltiple. La solución que arrojó fue un modelo político de significado universal. A lo largo del tiempo, el concepto ha mostrado estar abierto e ilimitado, transformándose y adaptándose en diversos momentos. La reaparición del concepto de Tianxia obedece claramente al ascenso de China en el sistema internacional y del propio estado de la evolución disciplinar en aquel país. Diego.
Muy bien. So, what is Tianxia? It is a Chinese conceptual system that appeared more than 3 millennia ago during the Zhou dynasty, which can be traced even further back and which has recently been reviewed by Zhao Tingyang as a Chinese way of thinking about international relations. According to this author, the system originally sought to solve the specific problem of the small ruling the large and a one ruling the multiple. However, the solution yielded a political model of universal meaning. Over time, the concept has shown to be open and unlimited, transforming and adapting at various times. The reappearance of the concept of Tianxia is clearly due to the rise of China in the international system and the very state of disciplinary evolution in that country. Alejandro.
Sí, con respecto al ascenso económico de China, resulta claro, como indicó oportunamente Dani Rodríguez, que si bien Beijing se benefició de la globalización, no lo hizo siguiendo los lineamientos del llamado consenso de Washington, sino siguiendo un camino propio. Y esas características fueron las que permitieron su crecimiento hacia la cúspide del poder mundial, las que llevarán más temprano que tarde a que China refleje mejor sus puntos de vista en el orden global. Eso se manifestó en la evolución del desarrollo disciplinar de los estudios internacionales de China, que hoy se encuentran en una fase donde muchos académicos buscan explicar la realidad y comprenderla en términos desde una perspectiva inconfundiblemente china. Sí.
Regarding the first question, this being China's economic rise, it is clear, as Danny Roderick pointed out, that although Beijing benefited from globalization, it did not do so by following the guidelines of the so-called Washington Consensus, but by following its own path. And these characteristics were the ones that allowed its growth towards the top of the world power, the ones that led, sooner rather than later, to China to reflect better its points of view in the global order. This was reflected in the evolution of the disciplinary development of international studies in China, which today is in a phase where many academics seek to explain reality and understand social phenomena from an unmistakable Chinese perspective. Alejandro.
Sí. El tratamiento que el mainstream le ha dado al tema podemos dividirlo en dos núcleos. Si tiene una aplicación universal, si el concepto tiene una aplicación universal, y la tensión jerarquía-anarquía que tendría implícitamente su aplicación. Para Chairia, uno de los desafíos del pensamiento internacionalista china es tanto sinosizar las teorías occidentales, realismo, institucionalismo y constructivismo, como de desarrollar teorías para universalizarlo. La Tianxia, y en ese sentido la Tianxia, es presentada como un sistema armónico, asentado en la jerarquía, que según esas visiones generan lógicas de titularización bastante diferentes a las anárquicas, con su enfoque en el estado absoluto de la igualdad soberana. Esto dice Acharya y Busa. La adhesión a la Tianxia se sustenta en que se hace, sin embargo, la adhesión a la Tianxia se sustenta en que sea aceptado y beneficiosa para todos los miembros de la sociedad internacional. Diego.
In the treatment that the mainstream has given to the subject, we can divide it into two nucleus. If it has a universal application and the hierarchy-anarchy tension that its application will implicitly have. For Acharya, one of the challenges of Chinese internationalist thought is both to synthesize Western theories, this being realism, institutionalism, and constructivism, and to develop theories to universalize them. The Tianxia is presented as an harmonious system based on the hierarchy, which, according to these views, generates securitization logics which quite different from the anarchic ones, with their focus on the absolute state of sovereign equality. Adherence to Tianxia is sustained that it is accepted and beneficial to all members of international society. Alejandro.
Sí. En el lado crítico al concepto de la tianxia encontramos, entre otros autores, a Henry Kissinger, quien sostuvo que este concepto es más duradero, más claramente definido y más lejano a las ideas westfalianas. Según este autor, ello se debe a que la jerarquía y no la igualdad soberana fue históricamente el principio organizador de los sistemas de Asia Central. A pesar de estas afirmaciones, los defensores de la tianxia sostienen que el imperialismo es un sistema que anula la soberanía y que este fue una invención occidental y que busca conquistar y lograr una regla dominante, mientras que el sistema chino tiene como objeto crear un sistema mundial que pueda convertirse en un punto focal, benevolente para todos. Sí, Diego.
On the critical side, we find, among others, authors like Henry Kissinger, who argued that this concept is more durable, more clearly defined, and the furthest from Westphalian ideas. According to this author, this is because hierarchy, not sovereign equality, was historically the organizing principle of international systems in Asia. Despite these claims, the defenders of tianxia maintain that imperialism is a system that nullifies sovereignty and that this is a Western invention that seeks to conquer and achieve a dominant rule, while the Chinese system aims to create a world system that can become a benevolent focal point for all, a focal point for sharing all cultures, all peoples, and all religions. Alejandro.
Siempre que se escribe sobre teorías de relaciones internacionales, nos encontramos con una particular división internacional del trabajo académico en términos norte-sur, en donde Estados Unidos, Gran Bretaña y en menor medida Europa Occidental serían el centro que producen los conceptos, mientras que el sur, la periferia, como mero receptor de aquellos. Para que ello sea posible, y como lo ha señalado Pierre Bourdieu, es necesaria la aceptación de la universalización de los conceptos en el campo científico, que se corresponden a la búsqueda de una generalización de una particularidad, en este caso específicamente anglosajona, cuya posibilidad de reproducirse se debe al hecho de que el centro disciplinar se piensa como portavoz y portador de lo universal. Romper con estos esquemas asimétricos y la creación de nuevos parámetros de relaciones con el mundo, donde la armonía y las particularidades sean tenidas en cuenta, nos ayuda a construir una comunidad de futuro compartido para la humanidad, como reza el lema de esta convocatoria.
Whenever we write about theories of international relations, we do not find a particular international division of academic work in North-South terms, where the United States, Great Britain, and, to a lesser extent, Western Europe would be the center where the concepts are produced, while the South, the periphery, as a mere recipient of those. For this to be possible, and as pointed out by Pierre Bourdieu, it is necessary to accept the universalization of concepts in the scientific field that respond to the search for a generalization of a particularity, in this case specifically Anglo-Saxon, whose possibility of being produced is because of being the disciplinary center. It is thought as bearers and spokesmen of the universal. Breaking with these asymmetric schemes and creating new parameters of relationships in the world, where harmony and particularities are taken into account, will help us build a community of shared future for humanity, as the motto of these talks reads.
Muchas gracias a todos por su atención y bueno, gracias Diego por la excelente traducción.
Bueno, muchas gracias Alejandro, y realmente lo hemos hablado varias veces, creemos en esta necesidad de romper un poco con los mitos, ¿no? de la división entre el pensar occidental y justamente las teorías orientales para destrabar un poco esta relación y para promover la cooperación entre ambas regiones, ¿no? I think it's really important for us to think about both concepts, ¿no? Because it helps us to promote the cooperation between our regions. Te doy la palabra, Francesca, para continuar.
Yes, yes. Thank
Gracias.
you, Professor Simonov. I remember a lot of conversation on these topics in our university in La Plata, no? In front of a coffee. So thank you so much for your brilliant speech, as always. Now it's the turn of another dear friend of us, Professor Li Kaishang from Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. I briefly give you a presentation of him. He's a Deputy Director and Research Fellow in the Institute of International Relations of Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences in China. Professor Li has a master's degree and a PhD in international relations from the Graduate School of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And from 2004 to March 2013, he served as a lecturer and then associate professor in Shanghai University. In 2013, he joined SAS Institute of International Relations and was promoted as research fellow at the end of 2015. He was the deputy director of SAS Think Tank Coordination Office from December 2017 to January 2019. His research interests include China's foreign strategy, East Asian security, the Belt and Road Initiative, non-traditional security, and international relations theories, etc. Thank you so much, Professor Li Kaishang. So I give you the floor.
Thank you, dear Maria. Good morning, the friends in Argentina. Good evening, my friends in China. I'm so honored to be here, sharing some opinions. Firstly, I want to thank Maria, thanks Dr. Kasani, Dr. Lumili. Thanks for your excellent organization of this wonderful event. I try to finish my presentation in 10 minutes. In my presentation, I think there is a key word, New Cold War. Actually, two key words, New Cold War and community of shared future for mankind. In my presentation, I use a shorter term, human community, to replace the community of shared future for mankind. As you know, actually, since President Xi Jinping came to power, he suggested a comprehensive foreign policies to build the community of shared future for mankind. I think by this suggestion, China is trying to develop a friendly relations with all countries, including the Western countries. For example, President Xi Jinping suggested the new type of great powers relations with the US, EU, and Russia, and so on. But maybe the US has a different idea. Actually, US has shown its intention to launch a new Cold War. Maybe some people don't think that, but if you look at the President Biden's visit to Europe recently, actually, I think the most important goal of his visit is to organize an encirclement against China. So in this case, I think there is a big challenge for China, especially for its vision of human community. This vision is still possible. I think this is a big question, a big challenge for current China's foreign policy. To get a better understanding of this big question, in my presentation, I will analyze three smaller questions. Question one, a new Cold War is coming. Second one, will China be forced into a new Cold War? Question three, how to achieve the community of shared future for mankind after the pandemic? About the first question, I think the Cold War means two things. The first thing is the power rivalry. The second thing is ideological competition. According to this definition of Cold War, I think currently the US is trying to launch a new Cold War with China. 4 points. Firstly, I think the US now it recognizes the CPC as the authoritarian regime. and China also an enemy of so-called free world. This is point one. Secondly, U.S. believes China is only rival with the comprehensive power. So I think this is why President Biden he don't believe Russia is a real threat. Point three, I think actually currently the U.S. has launched a comprehensive rivalry on China, including so many policy tools. For example, in trade, in science, and so on. Lastly, I think the U.S. is trying to organize a unified front against China. This front is including EU, Japan, even including South Korea, Russia. Especially, I think after the COVID-19 pandemic, China could be recognized as more serious competitor by the U.S. and its ideological allies, because China has showed had a better performance in combating the pandemic. So this is, I think, U.S. is trying to launch a new Cold War against China. But the next question is that will China be enforced into a new Cold War? Firstly, I want to say China has no intention be in the new Cold War with the U.S. because the peace for us is the best approach for China. So I think the key challenge for China is if it could be to avoid the destiny of new Cold War with the U.S. My answer is yes. One, two. I have some answers in two levels. First level is unit level. I mean, in the level of actors, the first actor is China, because I think the Cold War means two antagonistic ideological blockers. But I think because of two actors, this the two antagonistic ideological blockers could not be developed. The first actor is China itself, because China believes in particularism. Actually, China doesn't want to expand its ideological expansion. Of course, China has some ideological propaganda, but I think it's the only goal is to consolidate its domestic legitimacy rather than spreading it abroad. So this is very important. Another very important actor is Europe, because now U.S. is trying to unify Europe to organize a unified front against China with Europe. But I think, of course, Europe is a ideological ally for the U.S. But I think from the geopolitical perspective, in the perspective of Europe, actually Russia is a geopolitical challenge, not China. So I think this is very important. So this is the level of unit. In structure level, I think two factors are so important. The first thing is the new era, because I think compared with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, now it's a era of globalization. Now it's a era of interdependence. This is so important. The second factor in this level is new paradigm of power shift. I think before for the World Organization, for the world governance, the solar hegemony is so important. It's so so important. But I think now no one country could dominate the world. A new world governance rather than solar hegemony I think is coming into being. So I think this is so very, very important. So this is why I believe China could avoid the destiny of new Cold War with the US. Of course, but now currently a very important challenge is that how to achieve the community of shared future for mankind after the pandemic, because everyone should know the COVID-19 pandemic is a big change for international relations for the world. So after the pandemic, to achieve the human community is so important. I think to achieve that, two preconditions are so important. One of that is the change of intention in American side. Because before I said, just now I said, US is trying to launch a new Cold War, but so it is necessary for the US to change this intention. But I think it is possible to change that because of Biden actor, because the Biden administration, I think he believes the necessity of cooperation and rule-based competition. So this is a new opportunity for two powers, China and the US, to develop a new relations. So this is one precondition. The second precondition is a new competition relations between China and the US. It means the relations of competition plus cooperation. So this is a very comprehensive relations. This is so important for this bigger powers to develop these relations. So this is two preconditions. Next, I think two approaches are so necessary in and after the pandemic. The first one is to organize a collective battle against the COVID-19. Because now I think to combat the COVID-19 should be an opportunity for US, for China, for all the world to form a collective organization. I think this is very important. The second thing is to renovate the collective governance in restoring the global economy. So I think we should pay more attention to the importance of some international organizations, for example, UN, World Bank, WTO, G20, and so on. They are so important for rebuilding a healthy global economy. They are so important for achieving the human community. I stop here. I think my 10 minutes is out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Li Kaishang. So very interesting your questions. No? So maybe after, if somebody wants to answer to them also briefly, or just to have an interchange between us. No. Now we have Professor Wan Longxing. Professor Wan Longxing is full professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, expert in sociocultural analysis of knowledge and communication, and he has been in charge of press for the group of researchers of social sciences in the cultural section of the Chinese embassy in Spain. He will talk us about the deepening the understanding between Latin America and China for a shared future, Argentina media portrayal of China during the COVID-19 period in 2020. So thank you, Professor Wang, and I give you the floor. We can't listen to you very clearly. We can see perfectly your PowerPoint. Almost. Very, very low level of your speaking.
Francesca,
Sí.
¿por qué no decís que de Cesarín y después, mientras reglas, íbamos ganando tiempo?
Okay, dale. Professor Wang, I go ahead with the last professor, the last expositor, and in the meanwhile, if you can solve the problem of your speaking of your microphone, maybe could be an idea, okay? Because I'm sorry for Chinese friends because it is already very late there. So we can go on with Professor Sergio Cesarín. So I give you, Laura, the word.
Thank you, Francesca. Well, now we have to present Professor Sergio Cesarin. He is a fellow researcher in the National Council of Technological and Scientist Research, CONICET, from Argentina. And he is director of the Center of Asia, Pacific and India Studies Center in the University of National University of 3 de Febrero. He is deputy director in this university, and he is a professor in Asian studies in the same university, and he is the professor in our special Chinese master degree. So it's a pleasure to present you, Sergio, and he's talking about the Chinese Communist Party, revolutionary ethics and epics. Thank you very much, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, my dear colleagues in Buenos Aires, in Civitavecchia, and good evening in Beijing. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar celebrating 100 years of CCP Foundation. Especially thanks to Dr. Norberto Consani and my colleagues, Dra. Francesca Staiano, Laura Bogado. Thank you for introducing me in this webinar, and Professor Millie Lung, who hardly worked to prepare this webinar. Thank you all. On this occasion, I would like to expose some aspects which I consider relevant to highlight CCP long history. The first point I would like to expose is we have to understand that the key place the CCP takes as political force in China's 20th century history. As we know, early this century, as Dr. Santillán spoke early, the CCP Foundation and revolutionary movement was, in a sense, a political response to declining ancient China. Given that scenario, the party took the center of political scene, well aware of the need for radical changes in a country dominated by colonialism and foreign forces. In those days, the CCP third generation leaders lead the way to China's recovery, following an epic vision. This epic vision tried to restore political order and enforce a new set of social values, breaking with typical set of values of the traditional society. Finally, at the end of the decades of political and military struggle against domestic and external forces, the long march to the revolutionary dream became reality and still is a turning point in China's modern history. In most words, CCP leaders, peasants, workers, and soldiers' alliance allowed to establish new China bases in 1949. In these times, nowadays, in these days, once again, as in the past, after 100-year history, an epic vision named Chinese Dream guides CCP's public policies, economic and social agenda, and sustaining party role as a strong China's modernization leading force. This is the first point. The second point I would like to share with you is this movement, it was not only an epic revolution, but also an ethical one. Why? Revolutionary vision and symbolism was linked with ethic agents in the field. Through a wide set of rules and ethics code, CCP leaders enforced a new set of socialist values across the countryside. Thanks to those actions, CCP revolutionary goals won mass support and legitimacy. Perhaps after many years, currently President Xi Jinping seems to follow this way of thinking and political tradition. Reinforcing bureaucratic and party members' public and private ethic, he's trying to sustain CCP political leadership in the context of, as Mr. Yang Shuetong said, China's rising power and voice in global stage. The third point I want to highlight is, despite of CCP 100 years along his history, has shown flexibility to adapt their working methods, structures, and functions to domestic and emerging global tendencies. I think the flexibility of this complex structure, the organic structure, the membership of the party as political force is one of the most, to me, is one of the most important points to be seen in this time. For example, changing CCP perceptions on regional and world affairs at the end of the 70s paved the way for economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping open door policy. Avoiding factional tension, domestic factional tension within the party, the strategy showed CCP sense of opportunity and pragmatism to overcome China's economic structural conditions. At that time, an historical opportunity for China economic modernization. Therefore, by reducing poverty and raising living standards, CCP leaders tried to renovate party social contract. On the other hand, during the last years, since President Xi took power in 2012, think tanks, or named small leading groups, were created following this trend to provide leaders, political leaders, acknowledge on regional and global trends useful to be used as tool for planning and diplomacy tasks. Adaptation, flexibility, of the CCP along its history. The next point I want to expose is the CCP history and revolutionary success have had influence on political forces around the world. After PRC foundation, CCP worldwide relevance increased due to a revolutionary praxis success, a strong individual leadership, internal discipline, powerful army, PLA, People Liberation Army, qualified cadres and intellectuals support. Centered in Mago figure, CCP domestic measure and foreign policy strategies also has brought political changes in many regions, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin American countries. For example, non-alignment movement, Mao's Third World Theory, concepts like social progress, social development, and US power counterbalance became all topics put into many Latin American countries' government agenda and leftist political parties across the region. As we can see in nowadays, as in the past, CCP long political history still exert a strong influence in our region. China's image through the region basically stands on its revolutionary past, independent foreign policy goals, economic model of reform, and the role of the state role in this process of economic modernization. Multi-level political dialogue, South-South cooperation initiatives, cultural exchanges, and shared vision on global affairs also enrich bilateral relationships. If we see the numbers under shared development strategy, over the last 20 years, both sides deepen economic interdependence. China has expanded trade flows with Latin American countries. Chinese companies made huge investment through the region. Loans and credits provided by China banks have quickly become one of the largest sources of financing projects like railways, dams, energy, telecommunication, in mining, agri-food sector, and so on. All these projects help our region to overcome structural dysfunctions. Finally, in this context, central and local governments, business communities, political parties, non-government actors, workers, even academic exchanges have had a key role to encourage long-term China-Latinoamerican countries' better relationships. In conclusion, for everything I've said, looking forward, we do hope China policy toward Latin American countries under CCP leadership will continue to deepen exchanges and speed up both sides' win-win cooperation initiative, building together a community of shared future for mankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Cesarin. It's always a great honor to have you with us discussing on China and international relations between China and Latin America. In the meanwhile, I am Professor Wang Longxing. I think we could solve the problem, really, Professor Wang?
Yes, I think we can.
Yes, okay, perfectly. So I am going with your PowerPoint.
Thank you a lot.
Okay. Give me a second.
If I don't have any choice to use my mobile phone for the connection, there is no audio service on my computer. I'm really sorry for that, but it's a great honor this night in China and this morning in Argentina to have this conversation with all of the colleagues and the researchers or distinguished guests that we have here. And my topic today is about the media portrayal of China during the COVID-19 period in 2020, especially in the Argentinian media. So it's a topic that I have been studying for several years about Latin American countries and their medias, newspapers, deepening the understanding between both sides, so Latin American countries and China, especially in these cases, Argentina. Since 1972, when the two countries established diplomatic relations, the relationship between China and Argentina has been intensifying in parallel to the increasingly relevant role of China in the international economy. For Argentina, the People's Republic of China has surpassed the United States in ranking of its trade partners, only behind Brazil. In terms of finance or economic influence, Argentina is one of the main recipients of the Chinese funds or foreign direct investment. During the pandemic, the two countries have been consolidating their ties even more. Under the new situation, President Xi Jinping has maintained close contact with Alberto Fernandez. The diplomacy of the China and Latin America, or China and Argentina, make it possible the delivery of vaccines, the investment plan for more than 30,000 million in Argentina, the 4 geopolitical sensitivity projects. In addition, the Argentinian government has expressed interest in joining the Silk Road Initiative, the infrastructure mega project promoted by China. And first of all, I would like to present the theoretical framework that we have used in our study. The first one is the framing theory. In fact, the concept of frame appears for the first time in the field of psychology in the theory of play and fantasy. The anthropologist Gregory Bateson in 1955, and Goffman mentioned in 1970. And 1990, 1980, there were lots of investigators and researchers devoted to this line of investigation. And we use it to the analysis of a country's image, because most of the application of this theory is about the newspaper and their portray on a country or on the individual ones that we can imagine. And the second perspective of our theory is about the image of China, the importance of national image. Since the 20th century, particularly in Cold War era, governments are realizing that the importance of the systematic construction of the image between the United States and the Soviet Union. But for China, the construction of this image has not been systematical. Not only are the foreign publicity department and the new information office established in the new century, but the white papers on sensitive topics such as human rights, the situation on Tibet, China's national defense are also frequently published. China's image in Latin America and particularly in Argentina, generally, the image of China in Latin America is more positive than of the Western world and much more negative than that of Africa. The commercial relationship between China and South America has grown dramatically since the beginning of the 21st century. However, the Sino-Latin American ties essentially make use of bilateral trade, while relationships in other areas are very weak. So the most mentioned on the image of China is on the aspect of economic exchange. So we arise this problem, where do those phenomena such as the lack of knowledge and the presence of a stereotype originate? And there are plenty of investigators in Latin America have proposed their opinions, but Guo Cunhai summarizes the reason of the misunderstanding about Asia countries in Latin America. On the one hand, Western ideas and values causes prejudice, further intensifying negative evaluations of China in Latin America. On the other hand, the Western media predominance in Latin America, public opinions in the Latin American press depends on Western agencies as news sources. In Argentinian press, the economy is the most discussed topic after analyzing 3 Argentinian newspapers, La Nación, El Cronista, Ámbito Financiero. Camila Pérez Ciribe finds that the media pay most of their attention to the economic area, but there is lack of coverage in other aspects about China. So let me introduce my study with the methodological framework. The first one is the content analysis, and we choose the 2 newspapers or 2 medias in Argentina. One is Clarín. The Clarín was founded in 1945. It's the main Argentinian newspaper with the highest circulation in Spanish-speaking world. And another is Infobay. It was founded in 2002. It's the most visited news site in the country with 39% of the digital audience. So the period of our analysis is from the January 1st, 2020 to December 31, the last day of 2020. The search keywords China and coronavirus. And we use at least 3 times coronavirus and at least 3 times or 2 times China. And another one is 4 times, because the difference of frequencies about the reports of China. And now we can, after chosen these 2 newspapers, we use 2 coders to make the codification of these newspapers and make a content analysis. There is a schedule of preguntas, or schedule of questions that we have been launched as the hypothesis and research questions. The first one is regarding those variables. Is there a difference between Clarín and Infobae? And the second one is, what news frames predominance in the treatment of China? And the third question is regarding the frames that have subcategories, which type was more predominant? And the last one is, between all the variables, is there a link between them? The first discussion that we have found is around towards the first question that we have made, is the number of news. We can see on the first graph is observed that the news about China and coronavirus increases between January and March and decreases since April. And with its peak located in March and April, this curve matches the spread of COVID-19 nationally and globally. As the situation becomes increasingly severe, Argentina press is reporting more about coronavirus and China. The boom occurs in March and April as Argentina confirms the first case of coronavirus on the 3rd of the month. And regarding the difference between 2 newspapers, no, we still on the first graph. Yeah, from January to March, Infobae pays attention to the coronavirus in China earlier than Clarín. Infobae's anticipation records his slogan, "Read it before." And the Infobae is characterized by publishing news before all other media and leaving readers well informed about the facts and events every day. And then the second one is about the newspaper's tone. So we can get to the next page. Generally, the Argentinian media adopt a neutral attitude about the image of China. We can see in the table 1. So as in some months, Clarín and Infobae only have one piece of news. The data for this month is eliminated with attention is paid to each month. Clarín has more positive tone in most months, especially in March and August. In March, it mainly reports with recognition of the measures taken by China that have been fighting the epidemic. While in August, it abounds of favorable reports on Chinese vaccines. Clarin's attitude towards China reaches the most negative point during the months of June and July, because there then conspiracy theories and unfounded accusations appear, for example, highlighting the inactions of the Chinese government or the demonizing the country's status with the free market of China. As for Infobae, throughout 2020, its journalistic tone remains more or less neutral, except in January. According to January newspapers articles, Infobae portrays the Asia country as a suspended and closed society, a government incapable of reacting in time. Regarding to the news sources, the newspapers depend on the news sources in the following order. We can see in the table 2, Argentina news sources first, China second, USA third, Europe fourth, and United Nations after the Europe sources, and then Latin American countries sources. About the aspects mentioned, we can see on the table, the next one, that as I have said, generally the news coverage of China in Argentina newspaper focuses on economic issues. However, under the context of COVID-19, there is a balance between all 5 aspects. And we can see the next one is the frame that has been used in these articles that we have analyzed. In common, there are 4 levels of frequencies among the 10 frames. We can see the next page, see the figure 3. Marie? So, yeah, we can get to the next page. At the first level is the conflict frame predominance. We can see these pyramids that we have here. At the next level are those of financial consequences or economic consequences and attribution of responsibilities and hope. Then there are those of help, politics, morals, human interests, and finally those of fear and race have hardly been used. From these results, we can conclude that the media tries to clarify the role of China during the pandemic and conveying hope within the crisis. So from the perspective of each media, Clarín prefers more those of conflict, hope, economic and political consequences, while Infobae mainly likes those of attribution of responsibilities. Taking into account the journalistic tone, we observe another difference between 2 media on the use of economic consequences. For Infobae, the more news there is with the framework of economic consequences, the tone is more positive. However, for Clarín, the more news there is with the frame of economic consequences, tone is more negative. And about the subcategories of frames, before coding, several subcategories have been established under 5 frames. As for the conflict setting, the conflict between China and the US predominates and due to the bilateral tensions. And then the Sino-Argentinian conflict also abounds, especially in the Infobae report. There are relatively few conflicts between China and Europe and between China and the other Latin American countries. Regarding other types, most are conflicts in which China is not involved. So perhaps it's about the domestic conflicts within the Argentina or between Argentina and other countries. Under the frame of economic consequences, half of the news articles have confidence in a good economic impact from China, and another half suspect that China produces a negative effect on Argentina or global economy. Specifically, Clarín tends to believe that China can offer opportunities, while Infobae is inclined to consider China's role as one that hurts its economy. According to the results of attribution of responsibility, the Argentina media prefer to blame China for the problems or negative situation during COVID-19. In the news, it is emphasized that China is origin of the virus, diverting the impact of coronavirus towards the full responsibility of Asian countries. In addition, conspiracy theories place many unfounded blame on China. On issues related to values, China is represented mainly as an adversary against Argentina or global vision of value. The news that takes the human interest framing is mainly individual stories or interviews and not occupy many spaces. The last analysis that we have is about the links between variables. In this study, both classical frames like the conflict, the human interest, economic consequences, and morality, and the emerging frames, politics, race, fear, hope, and help are investigated. The hope frame has a significant difference from the conflict frame. When there is a hope frame, there's never a conflict frame. And secondly, the politics frame has another significant link with the conflict frame. When there is a policy frame, a conflict frame usually appears. And last but not least, into the conclusion, this work attempts to study how the Argentinian newspapers or medias present the image of China in the context of coronavirus. In response to the first question, and the media coverage of Argentina digital press adopt a more or less neutral attitude towards China and the coronavirus, taking into account other variables. This journalistic tone may be due to the trade-offs that between episodic and the thematic frames, that between the 5 aspects and between the Western sources and the Chinese sources. Respect to the second question, due to its similar political tendency or inclination, the liberalism, the two media, Clarín and Infobay, do not present much differences, except for the frequency of attribution of responsibility and the tone trend of economic consequences. About the third and the fourth questions of investigation in the treatment of the topic on China, the conflict setting predominates. References to the Sino-American tension about the conflicts. Furthermore, the conflict frame has some significant links with other variables. Perhaps the conflict setting is excluded with the hope setting, but it tends to appear alongside the political setting. Second, American sources prefer to report conflicts with Chinese sources, avoid them. And the third, the news with the conflict frame usually talks about the administration's aspects of the Chinese government and diplomacy and foreign relations. And that's all. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang. And I'm so happy that at the end you could make your exposition such interesting perspective and topic. So I think it's very late. So maybe we can have, I don't know, here I'm looking for some comment. Okay. Okay, I was sorry, I was reading now because before I was sharing my my desktop, so I couldn't see. I don't know if somebody has some observation or question during our panel, or otherwise I have some final observation. Then I give the word to Dr. Consani, and we are saying goodbye, if you agree. Because I think it's very late, especially in China. So I don't want to bother you anymore. So just sharing with you some perspective on this 100 of Chinese Communist Party, no? So we often speak of China as a crisis, no? As a binomial element in which there is a sort of shock between tradition and modernity, innovation and rituals. This dialectical binomial seems to refer to the relationship of relationships, as Professor Ching wrote when he was describing in terms of the theory of international relations that is going on between yin and yang. Two opposite elements, but at the same time necessary from each other. So, so that is China, but isn't China? Hasn't China the same problems that each country has? So why this dichotomy is typical from history of our countries, and we are here examining only China, and then why, how does China could struggle this dichotomy, no, and reach this rapid development? So I think the word is one, perseverance, no, perseverance in an ideology centered on people. And so the political history of Chinese Communist Party has represented an unicum in history. So the union between a socialist ideology and the solidity of a social body rooted in its own identity. So the Chinese Communist Party, I think, has embodied the suffering of Chinese people. working, studying, constantly improving, without have a rest, never, no? So this incessant, constant effort towards very high goals and common values, universally recognized by the international community as deserving of affirmation, as equality, elimination of poverty, improving the welfare state, social rights, moderately prosperous state, dual economy, environmental protection, accessibility, and social mobility. So I think what we are breathing in China is the possibility of change. It is the Chinese dream, the urge to imagine a wider horizon toward the construction of a community of shared destiny for humankind, toward the democratization of international relations, where the necessary interdependence between states is capable of creating a global symbiotic system in struggle with the century-old imperialist power. But this is a story, and hard story. It's a story full of contradiction, as Mao wrote and President Xi Jinping recalled. So it is a revolutionary story. So this is a story of a revolution. So I want to make this final comment. I don't know if Professor Bogado and Dr. Consani want to add something.
No, I just only, first of all, I would like to thank all the professors for their excellent reflections. No, I think that they really help us to know a little more about the Chinese people and through their political story. No, I think that many and very important things were commented here. All speeches are very important, and I take two words, two concepts that Professor Cesarin said, no? Adaptation and flexibility are both concepts are very important to show the Communist Party as a whole, no? So only I thank you all of the professor for being here, and see you next time. No?
Professore, tienes el micrófono apagato.
Professor, thank you for your participation. I hope really you join us in the new professor for the specialization, especially for the people from the Shanghai University, the two academy, the Fudan University. I hope in the next future, very near, maybe this second semester next year, you participate in our specialization. Like Liu Huaben, the people very, very happy with the participation, the Liu Huaben the last year. Maybe for the other conference, another opportunity, really excellent participation from the people from Argentina, from China. You are very friend of the IRI. I hope you join us in the specialization. Special for recognition Diego. Very nice, Diego. Your translation very, very clear for all of us. Alejandro, very special speaker in Spanish, very clear the position about the new theory in our not only Argentina, sino in Latin America, especially the reference from the professor with recognized very, very strong like the autonomy theory. I think in the future we work together for a new humanity, the title of this seminar, with the new community. Never again the colonialism and the neocolonialism in our humanity. very, very for the new conference when finish.
Okay, so thank you so much again. I really appreciate your intervention, and we keep in touch. So have a nice night in China, have a nice day in Argentina. I'm in the middle of in the afternoon in Rome. It's 5 of the afternoon. So see you soon, and thank you again, and hoping to see you in the next conference. Bye-bye.